I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Has your healthcare provider checked your vitamin D levels lately? Why is this so important during the COVID-19 pandemic? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
A study at the University of Chicago suggests that people with low levels of vitamin D in their bloodstreams may be more susceptible to infection with SARS-CoV-2. How much is enough to provide protection?
Scandinavian grandmothers used to dose their families with cod liver oil. They had no idea why it might have been beneficial during winter months. Is vitamin D the magic ingredient in cod liver oil?
Which form of vitamin D works best?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, get the lowdown on vitamin D against COVID-19.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, hospitals across the country are struggling to provide care for increasing numbers of COVID-19 patients. At last count, there were more than 110,000 people hospitalized with this disease. As a result, healthcare facilities might be tempted to discharge recovering patients as soon as possible to make room for newly diagnosed individuals. A study from the Veterans Administration suggests that could be risky. The investigators analyzed records from patients discharged between March and July to assess readmission and death. Out of more than 2,000 people hospitalized, 1,775 survived to be discharged. Over the next 2 months, 1 in 5 was readmitted, and 9% died. The analysis demonstrated that the first 10 days after discharge were the riskiest in this population, which is composed largely of older male patients.
Will a ring help diagnose COVID-19? Early detection can help people avoid infecting others. Researchers now report that the Oura ring may be able to detect fever at an early stage of infection. Oura is spelled O-U-R-A. It fits on the finger and monitors heart rate variability, respiration, physical activity, and sleep quality. It also collects continuous temperature data during the day and night. Information is transmitted to the user's smartphone and stored on the cloud. The 50 individuals in this pilot study were already using Oura rings before the study began. They had also experienced COVID-19 symptoms. The investigators detected changes in daily body temperature patterns a few days before people reported symptoms. Wearable monitors might be able to detect infectious outbreaks such as influenza before patients become aware of surges.
This week, the FDA authorized a home diagnostic test for COVID-19. Unlike previous home tests, this one does not require a prescription, and the results can be read and interpreted by the patient. Even in people with no symptoms, the test accurately identifies negative samples 96% of the time and positive samples 91% of the time. That level of accuracy no doubt figured into the FDA's decision to proceed with emergency use authorization. It means, however, that even people who get a negative result should continue to use precautions, as they might still be carrying the virus. The maker is an Australian company called Ellume.
20 years of data collected by the Dallas Heart Study suggests that one measure of inflammation is strongly linked to depression. In 2000, researchers recruited a diverse group of Texans between 30 and 65 years old. They filled out medical questionnaires, provided blood samples, and agreed to imaging studies. The scientists have followed them regularly. One research team reports that levels of an inflammatory compound called glycate track closely to the severity of symptoms of depression. Their study could not determine whether glycate causes depression or if it's elevated as a result of the mood disorder.
The next story is based on data from an epidemiological study, not a randomized controlled trial. This study was based on data from the UK Biobank. Over 1,700 adults between 46 and 77 years of age provided detailed information about their eating habits. They were asked about tea, coffee, and alcohol consumption, as well as foods like fruits, vegetables, fish, meat, bread, cheese, and cereal. They were also tested for cognitive performance with something called the Fluid Intelligence Test, FIT. To the surprise of the investigators, people who ate cheese daily had better FIT scores. Moderate red wine consumption added to that effect. People who were at particular risk for Alzheimer's disease because of their genetic makeup fared worse on the FIT if they ate a lot of salt. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Scientists have long suspected that vitamin D may influence the immune system's ability to respond to pathogens. How does that relate to COVID-19?
To find out, we are talking with an investigator who published a study looking at COVID infection rates and previously measured vitamin D levels. Dr. David Meltzer is the Fannie L. Pritzker Professor of Medicine, Chief of the Section of Hospital Medicine, and Director of the Center for Health and the Social Sciences at the University of Chicago.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. David Meltzer.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to join you today.
Well, we are delighted to speak with you. First of all, why did you study vitamin D deficiency? What intrigued you about this concept?
Well, it's kind of funny. I'm not someone who's been studying vitamin D in the past. The way this happened was I literally got a random email back in March, just when all this was going crazy. And the header of the email said vitamin D deficiency associated with increased viral respiratory tract infections. And I thought, oh, wow, COVID's a viral respiratory tract infection. So I started reading the article. It was a meta-analysis, a sort of combination of many studies. The combination study, the meta-analysis was done by Adrian Martineau, who's in the UK. And what it showed is that patients who had vitamin D deficiency, who were given vitamin D supplementation, had a dramatically lower risk of viral respiratory tract infections, about as much as 70% reduction. And I thought that was a really striking result. And I knew enough from medical school to know that coronaviruses are a common cause of viral respiratory tract infections in general, and thought, well, this is a coronavirus. Maybe it's the same thing. And so it occurred to me that we had a lot of patients coming into our hospital who were here in Chicago, the University of Chicago Medicine, who were getting tested for coronavirus, and that for many of them, we might have historical vitamin D values, and that we would be able to look within our own data to see whether people who were vitamin D deficient were more or less likely than people who weren't to test positive for coronavirus. So that's how I got started.
Well, that is fascinating. So you already had the vitamin D data. People were already coming into the hospital to get tested. Please tell us what you found.
Well, so what we found was that patients who were vitamin D deficient had about a 77% increase in their likelihood of testing positive compared to people who were not vitamin D deficient. And that analysis included both reflecting the levels that they had when they were most recently measured, but also any intervening treatments that we could measure. So that really struck us, and we got all the necessary approvals to dig into more detailed data and prepared a manuscript. We originally put out a manuscript, I believe it was in late April or early May, that was published on a preprint server, a meta-archive, and then sent it out for peer review. And that takes a while, even when everyone's trying to hurry up and get things published in in the era of COVID. That was eventually published in JAMA Network Open in early September.
Now, Dr. Meltzer, when you say a 77% increase in the likelihood of testing positive for COVID-19, that's a relative risk, right?
Right, exactly.
Do we have any idea what the absolute risk might have been?
Well, so I don't remember the exact numbers in our paper offhand. I think it's something like 12% versus almost 20%. It was a big number, but I want to emphasize that depends very much on the environment in which you're testing, right? If you're testing people who are relatively symptomatic and the prevalence is really high, on average, people are going to be more likely to be positive. Where if you're testing people who aren't so symptomatic and the prevalence, isn't that high or incidence really with new cases, then that number is going to be lower. So that absolute effect is in our environment. And of course, you'd want to look for similar results in other environments as well. And since the time that our study was published, there have been several other studies that have shown effects honestly not that different from ours in terms of relative risk, and in very different settings. One in Israel, one in studies around the US with data from Quest Diagnostics. So our result does not appear to be isolated only to our setting. There is one study that did not find the sort of results that we found, and that was a study done in the United Kingdom using data from their biobank. But the problem with that study is that the vitamin D levels were more than a decade old. And so, as you might imagine, whether you were vitamin D deficient or not a decade ago or so ago might not predict very well whether you are right now.
Exactly. And I'm holding up a study that was just published today from Greece, suggesting that people who had low 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels on admission to an intensive care unit ended up in a much worse situation. Many of them died if their vitamin D levels were really low. So I guess the real question here is what's going on?
Yeah.
Why would vitamin D make a difference?
Well, so I think the first thing we have to say is we don't know vitamin D makes a difference. We're not 100% sure. It could be, for example, that there was some other illness with these people or condition that caused them both to have low vitamin D levels and to be at increased risk for either getting COVID or having a bad outcome with COVID. So we need to be careful because I don't think anyone, at least from these sort of population studies, has really proven that vitamin D per se reduces the risk. That much said, there are very strong biological reasons to believe that vitamin D improves function of the immune system. It has value in improving innate immunity to things you've never seen before, adaptive immunity, the ability to respond rapidly to a pathogen you've seen in the past, and also immunomodulation, decreasing inflammation, which we know is a critical part of COVID. In addition, I do want to go back to this meta-analysis of randomized trials. Those are the sort of studies in which you can really infer causation. And in those settings, there does seem to be a causal effect. So, do I personally believe there is a causal effect? I think there's a very high probability. Am I 100% sure? No. And so I think it's really critical that we do studies that confirm, or at least I should say test this hypothesis. Now, that much said, here we are, hopefully with a vaccine beginning to come in a few days, but with the vast majority of us, not being vaccinated already and not going to be vaccinated right away. And what we do know from all sorts of other epidemiologic literature is that many, many individuals are vitamin D deficient. And we also know that you can give doses of vitamin D very safely to people as long as you don't exceed recommended levels. And I think there can be some rational discussion about what those recommended levels should be. And so I don't think we need to be paralyzed in action, waiting for the perfect evidence that's not going to be there in time to help us, at least in this pandemic. But that much said, I think we need to be careful both in how much we take and how we represent what we're doing. And I also believe it's really important that we study this and that we study it rigorously through randomized trials.
Well, we love randomized trials on the People's Pharmacy, but we also recognize that sometimes if the benefit risk analysis, favors the treatment, it might not be such a bad idea. So inquiring minds want to know, are you taking vitamin D after doing your study?
I am. I'm definitely taking vitamin D and recommending it to my friends and family. So I'm putting my mouth where my beliefs are, or whatever the right saying would be. So yeah, I'm doing it, and I think that it's a reasonable thing for lots of people to do. I do think there's room for study. I do think that, you could reasonably debate whether, what you need is something resembling the RDA, which is, somewhere between 600 and 800 for most people, not counting kids. The National Academy of Medicine has said that you can usually go up to 4,000 international units a day without, risk of complications. So that's probably a reasonable upper limit for most people. But we're now doing 3 separate studies here at the University of Chicago to try to better understand what the value of supplementation is. And one of them is with a very medically complex group of people where we're talking with them about the risks and benefits and trying to optimize their care and comparing their outcomes to a group of patients who are in a control group where we're not as engaged. A second study is a study that originally is involved just healthcare workers, where we're giving different doses, so low versus medium or high dose vitamin D. And we're actually going to try to, if we can, expand that study into the general population. And because we're giving high dose vitamin D up to 10,000 a day, we're doing some safety monitoring with that. And then we're rolling out a community study in Chicago communities, really heavily focused on capturing minority populations. Because as most people know at this point, the burden of COVID has been disproportionately on minority populations. And vitamin D raises very different issues in minority populations than in Caucasians. And I think that these issues around vitamin D may be particularly important for populations of color.
Dr. Meltzer, I hope you'll come back on the People's Pharmacy and let us know what you discover from these very important studies.
Oh, I'd be thrilled to. We've got more in the way.
Dr. David Meltzer, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. David Meltzer, Chief of the Section of Hospital Medicine and Director of the Center for Health and the Social Sciences and the UChicago Urban Labs Health Lab. He's the Fannie L. Pritzker Professor in the Department of Medicine, Department of Economics, and the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. You can find links to his research in the post about today's show at peoplespharmacy.com.
After the break, we'll examine the link between vitamin D and respiratory tract infections with Dr. Bruce Hollis.
What's the evidence that COVID is worse for people with low vitamin D levels?
Vitamin D is renowned for keeping bones strong, but it does a lot of other things as well. Find out what they are.
How much vitamin D does Dr. Hollis recommend for pregnant women?
We'll find out why the medical profession has been so skeptical about the value of vitamin D.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code PEOPLES25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. CocoVia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is PEOPLES10. Learn more at cocovia.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Today our topic is vitamin D and its impact on respiratory infections, especially COVID-19. We just heard from Dr. David Meltzer that patients at the University of Chicago with low vitamin D levels were more likely to have a positive COVID-19 test. To get a better understanding of vitamin D and how it functions in the body, we turn to one of the country's leading experts on this vitamin.
Our guest is Dr. Bruce Hollis, professor of pediatrics, biochemistry, and molecular biology, and director of pediatric nutritional sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Bruce Hollis.
Thanks for having me back. It's been several years. I think I spoke last time on this program in 2008, and I'm sure we had a lot of updates.
Oh, indeed we do. Time flies when you're having fun. Dr. Hollis, if we were to transport ourselves back 100 or more years to Scandinavia, we'd probably find that grandmothers there have been giving their children, and even adults for that matter, their children, cod liver oil for centuries. Now, they clearly didn't know anything about vitamin D, but their experience, and we kind of think sometimes experience has some value, that they thought maybe this tonic, this cod liver oil, might fight off colds and flu and maybe other infections as well. What does modern medicine have to tell us about vitamin D and susceptibility to respiratory tract infections?
Actually, a lot. Vitamin D is probably one of the strongest immune regulators that we know of. I mean, it's so diverse in its actions. It acts through the innate immune system, which is a primitive system that all animals have. If you don't have like an octopus or an insect, it's all they have because they don't have bone marrow. Vitamin D works through that, through the antimicrobial peptides, control of T cells. It also functions in the adaptive system. So in the production of antibodies and, again, adjustment of T cell activity and autoimmune. But clearly, vitamin D has an impact on respiratory infections, both from a standpoint of fighting the infection and also from a standpoint of adjusting the cytokine storm that in many cases are killing people.
Now we should explain what a cytokine storm is.
Yeah, so a cytokine storm is when pro-inflammatory cytokines are made in too high of an amount and actually turn on the body. And once that happens, you enter into something like septic shock. The body can't turn it off. Vitamin D upregulates anti-inflammatory cytokines and downregulates pro-inflammatory cytokines, which is very critical in this disease. That being said, is that one of the things that tamps this down is dexamethasone. So, that's been approved as a treatment, and that's basically what dexamethasone is doing. It does it better than vitamin D. I think vitamin D sets these systems up so when you get this, you don't enter into that phase in a critical fashion, into the cytokine storm.
Now, Dr. Hollis, We have all just heard Dr. Meltzer describing his research at the University of Chicago. It indicated that people who are low in vitamin D might be more vulnerable to COVID-19 and its complications. Is there other evidence that you're aware of that would corroborate that?
There's been all kinds of studies. I mean, I've been looking at these studies since March. And it's ironic that there are three initial studies that came out. One was from first one was Philippines, then one from Indonesia, and then one from India. And they were so good that it was almost they couldn't be believed, which was true. They're all fake. These scientists faked these papers, okay? And basically, the way those papers were written is that vitamin D would basically cure this, and that's not totally true. But there's been plenty of studies since then, one from Israel, but from an author called Mozan. This is an observational study, which is what you're talking about. And it was quite involved. And in fact, when that data was presented, and it was real data, I don't think you could find a vitamin D supplement in Israel after that was published. Literally. There's been other papers, other things published on observational studies, but actually been randomized trials with giving vitamin D or more active forms of vitamin D, and have been very successful at combating COVID, either making the virus disappear faster or keeping people out of the ICU or off ventilation. So there's a lot of this work out there. It's gone beyond observational studies, and the thing that infuriates me is that I don't know if you heard when Donald Trump was being treated and Anthony Fauci was being interviewed, somebody pressed him. They said, "Well, Dr. Fauci, what do you take?" And he says, "Well, I take vitamin D." And then they prodded him some more, and they said, "Well, how much do you take?" And he says, "I take 6,000 units per day." Yet you have to pry this information out of them, and they won't make this recommendation to the general public, although they clearly believe it because they're doing it themselves. And to me, that's quite infuriating. But see, they won't recommend anything, any treatment beyond, because it's not FDA approved. It hasn't been through a quote randomized controlled trial, so they're not going to be a proponent of its use.
Well, Dr. Hollis, what we have seen is that doctors are perfectly willing to say, yes, you should take a small amount of vitamin D, and it is a small amount, to make sure your bones stay strong, but they're not willing to talk about other activities of the vitamin. Can you tell us, please, what else does vitamin D do for us besides keep our bones strong?
Well, as we've just been talking, it's probably one of the strongest immune regulators in the body. The other thing is we've studied in my particular area, we studied vitamin D and prevention of complications of birth, which have been really successful in the last 10 years. We've been looking at it to prevent preeclampsia, to prevent preterm birth, and in fact, it's been so successful that the Food and Drug Administration, as of 2 years ago, allows label claims on vitamin D that it may improve birth outcomes. That was incredible to me, because they don't make those claims, let those claims on there lightly. So they were presented with the data from us and other grassroots health, and they petitioned to have that label claim made, and the FDA allowed it to be.
Let me ask what level of vitamin D a pregnant woman might take in order to have that kind of good outcome.
So our studies were all done on 4,000 units a day intake, our highest levels. Okay. And that was from the duration of when we saw the patients, which was the first trimester on. Now, I've been involved in a lot of other studies, prevention of asthma during pregnancy and the newborn, and what we see there in those studies with preeclampsia is, I would suggest that anybody who gets pregnant have a vitamin D level of at least 40 nanograms, because what happens, of course, at conception, all the lung development takes place in the first trimester. So if you're only studying after you've missed the first trimester, and then you start supplementing vitamin D, you're missing critical parts of placental implantation, lung development, things that vitamin D do. And so the ideal studies that we would like to do is do these studies pre-conception, but that's nearly impossible to do. So you have to look at the observational data, make a decision. Vitamin D is in no way harmful. I mean, we've looked at literally thousands of patients, giving them this amount, and have not had a single adverse event due to vitamin D.
Dr. Hollis, I'd like to ask you why your colleagues, why physicians in general, and I don't want to generalize, but for the most part, mainstream medicine looks upon vitamins with a skeptical eye. They know that there's a certain minimum amount to prevent rickets when it comes to vitamin D and a certain amount of vitamin C to prevent scurvy, but they're really focused mostly on deficiency diseases. And so we keep reading, all you need is a well-balanced diet. You don't need supplements. It's a waste of money. And you've already pointed out that Dr. Fauci, although he was taking a rather substantial amount of vitamin D himself, you had to kind of pull that information out of him. It was not something that he was willing to volunteer. Why do you think there's such skepticism when it comes to something like vitamin D or vitamin C?
Well, two different things. If you have a balanced diet, you can get, I think, plenty of vitamin C. You can take a supplement. It's not true with vitamin D. It's just not in foods we eat. And so it should have never been, I don't think it should have been labeled a nutrient. It should have been labeled a hormone. Actually, what we're doing is hormone replacement therapy. And so the stumbling block, why do guys like Fauci, is so resident to do this? And I think the problem is the Institute of Medicine, which is now called National Academy of Medicine, and their recommendations, which are based only on skeleton. They didn't even recognize that vitamin D had anything to do with anything else. Now, that's has changed in the last year, okay, with respect to vitamin D and prevention of cancer. I don't know if you've seen the last information that came out of the VITAL study, which was the big study run out of Harvard. It was $40 million. And they basically, what they did is they had thousands of patients, and the treatment groups were normal vitamin D, or the treatment group only got 2,000. And I was actually a scientific consultant on that, and I fought for higher levels, but I was overruled, and so they went with 2,000 units. At that time, it was a safe upper intake level. And I really thought they wouldn't see very much. Turns out the recent publication, it's in JAMA Open, shows a dramatic effect of vitamin D protection on metastatic cancers. And it's the first time that, in my recollection, that JAMA or New England Journal has published a positive paper on vitamin D. When we would submit our papers on vitamin D positive things, they would outright get rejected. So whenever you saw a paper come through JAMA or New England Journal about vitamin D, you didn't even need to read it. It was going to be a negative study. That's changed here with this JAMA paper coming out of VITAL. They basically just looked at that data and said it's not refutable. Vitamin D is fighting metastatic cancer.
Now, I do have a question about some studies where they don't show much benefit from quote unquote supplementation. And in a lot of those studies, they're giving like 100,000 international units by injection. And that was even true of one of the COVID studies. They waited for people to be fairly sick. They were in the hospital, and then they gave them the injection.
Well, it wasn't actually an injection. It was an oral dose. It was a big dose, 200,000 international units. And it did not make a difference from placebo, but that was in patients who were already hospitalized and severely ill.
Yeah, so you take those patients and give them any treatments, be it remdesivir, be it dexamethasone. I mean, they're all basically dying. And so you're trying to rescue. That's not the way vitamin D works. For starters, when you take the vitamin D, it has to be metabolically activated. And that's just not enough time to have that happen. Vitamin D treatments, like these other things, needs to be done in a preventative manner or early on in a sickness when somebody is just becoming ill. The viral load is lower. If you come in and do it if you come in and do it when the person presents and has horrific pneumonia, I don't think anything's going to help those people. But yet alone, when they do that and they publish something like vitamin D, they say, oh, here we go. We gave a lot of vitamin D and it didn't work, so vitamin D here is worthless.
Which is one possible conclusion, but not the best conclusion. What we can conclude is it didn't work that way in that trial.
That's correct.
Now, Dr. Hollis, what our listeners want to know is, should I be taking vitamin D? And if I should be taking it, how much should I take? And what form should I be taking? Can you give us some advice, please?
So I'll come back to the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Medicine now. And I've argued with this, and their recommendations were 800 units a day or 400 units, 600 units a day. To me, those levels are of almost no use, except it'll help you prevent bone disease. The problem, again, is if you come back to those recommendations, the Institute of Medicine didn't recognize that vitamin D had any effect on any other systems except bone, so they weren't going to make recommendations based on that. Again, I think that's going to change. My recommendation is that everybody should take 5,000 to 10,000 units of vitamin D a day, because people have different abilities to activate it. Not everybody's the same. You really need to take those levels and then have a blood test. My physician here in my physical, every year they measure my vitamin D. And I take 6,000 units a day, because 6,000 units a day of vitamin D for me keeps my level at 60 nanograms constant. I mean, that's what it is every year. So 6,000 units keeps my level at 60. My wife doesn't need to take as much to have her levels be 70 or 80, which is would seem high to a normal physician. But to me, that's really where you want to be. And again, we have not seen any adverse events for people taking these amounts. So, I mean, it's fairly radical from the standpoint of what's recommended, in the general population and physicians. But I'll bring you back to what our common practice is because of our research and our OB/GYN practice here at the medical university. Every woman who comes in the pregnancy clinic is now given 4,000 units of vitamin D per day.
And may I assume that you're using vitamin D3 rather than D2?
No, D2 shouldn't be used. There's no conditions on which that vitamin D2 should be used. It should always be D3, and that's correct. Where I get my vitamin D3 is at Costco, the Kirkland brand. And I know it's good because I've been using it for years, and it maintains my vitamin D levels at right where they should be.
You're listening to Dr. Bruce Hollis, Professor of Pediatrics, Biochemistry, and Molecular Biology, and Director of Pediatric Nutritional Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina.
After the break, we'll get some details on how our bodies make the hormone we call vitamin D. It's a lot more complicated than you might think.
Even though they didn't know anything about vitamin D, Scandinavian grandmothers have known for centuries how to harness its power with cod liver oil.
People worry about taking too much vitamin D for fear of toxicity. How much is too much?
Vitamin D insufficiency is a common problem. Who's at the greatest risk of not having enough vitamin D? Why does skin color make a difference?
Dr. Hollis offers his recommendations for how much to take. You should always check with your healthcare professional about the best amount for your own situation.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This podcast is brought to you by the Verrazana Health Club. This comprehensive home testing service enables you to track crucial health markers of gut health, inflammation, metabolism, hormones, thyroid function, and many other organ systems. Regular testing can help detect health imbalances before they lead to sickness. online at Verisana, verisana.com/health-club. Get 50% off the first month with the discount code PEOPLE50. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verisana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Today, we're talking about the essential role that vitamin D plays in protecting us against infections. Were you aware that it acts like a hormone? That makes it different from a lot of other vitamins.
Our guest is Dr. Bruce Hollis, professor of pediatrics, biochemistry, and molecular biology, and director of pediatric nutritional sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina.
Dr. Hollis, you mentioned that vitamin D is actually a hormone. You mentioned that it has to be activated, metabolically activated.
That sounds a lot to me like thyroid. So a lot of people take levothyroxine. The brand name is Synthroid. That's T4, but it's inactive. It doesn't do anything, or not very much. It has to be converted by the body into something called T3. Mm-hmm. And it's T3 that's actually doing the work. It sounds like vitamin D may be a little bit like that.
I wonder if you could, remembering that none of us actually are biochemists, or not very many of us, could you just walk us through the whole vitamin D chain of events from sun hitting skin to vitamin D hormone in the tissue being active?
Sure. So the way vitamin D was meant to be gotten by humans or in other animals is that you go in the sun, the sunlight hits your skin, converts a compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol, which your skin is loaded with, into vitamin D3. Okay, vitamin D3 then goes from the skin capillary beds into the circulation where it associates with a carrier protein and then gets distributed around the body. Okay. Now, that being the case, that can be substituted with taking vitamin D orally, and it would come in through your GI tract. Not exactly the same, but close enough. So once the vitamin D, I call it the parent compound, enters the bloodstream, it goes to various tissues, primarily the liver, where a hydroxyl group, an OH group, is added onto the vitamin D molecule. And now you have a compound called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. That compound is the intermediate form. That compound is the one that stays in your blood for weeks. Half-life is 2 to 3 weeks. And that's the compound that you have measured when you go to the physician. They draw the blood, they measure your 25-hydroxyvitamin D level. But that's not the active compound. Vitamin 25-hydroxyvitamin D then is further metabolized onto a compound called 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. And that's made primarily in the kidney. And when it's made in the kidney, that's primarily used to regulate calcium homeostasis, which we've known about for years. That's how vitamin D first came about, bone metabolism. Later on, we found out that vitamin D can also be activated in many cells in the body, including immune cells, where the vitamin D can enter into these cells and be converted all the way from vitamin D to 25 vitamin D to 125 to hormonal form within those given cells, and immune cells do that. And then what that means is that compound can be used right there to regulate antimicrobial peptides or cytokine production or cytokine inhibition. And that is what we call endocrine and paracrine action. So in a vitamin D world, you have an endocrine action, which means primarily controlling bone and calcium functions. And then you have the paracrine endocrine function, which controls everything else. They're two separate systems. And they have, as far as I'm concerned, has two separate levels. I mean, the endocrine needs very little vitamin D to function. That's where your 600 or 800 units do you okay. That's not true for the others. The other functions of paracrine and endocrine need much more. And that's where we get into trouble with the recommendations only based on skeleton.
So those Scandinavian grandmothers had no idea what you're talking about. They didn't know anything about converting 25-hydroxy to 1,25-dihydroxy in the kidney. All they knew was that in the wintertime, people got sick, and if they gave them cod liver oil, they somehow didn't get sick or not as sick.
That's yes.
And so they just had experience.
That's exactly correct. Just intuitively, winter came, this stuff seems to help keep people well. And also in Scandinavia, the fishermen would eat this meal they would take the cod and they would have this meal where they would eat the raw insides, the fish liver. And it was absolutely, I've seen it. It's absolutely disgusting, but they would eat this, and get tens of thousands of units of vitamin D. They didn't know that that's what they were getting, but they did it because they thought it improved their health, and I'm sure that it did.
So let me ask you, Dr. Hollis, one of the reasons that doctors worry about people taking vitamin D supplements in doses higher than 600 international units a day, they say vitamin D, it can be toxic. Can you tell us, please, about the toxicity of vitamin D?
Yeah, it can be toxic, but you need to take, 50,000. I know people that take 50,000 units a day as a normal course of action. Now, I don't recommend that. That's pharmacology. Okay, to me, physiological intake of vitamin D would go up to, say, 10,000 units a day because humans can generate that much on their own, given sunlight. So that's normal physiology. When you get above that, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000, those amounts of vitamin D would be used to treat, say, cancer or other diseases that like any other high amounts of drugs. So all this fear comes from past work that was really bad, and people thought they would get hypercalcemia or kidney stones. And by the way, there's no relationship between vitamin D intake and kidney stones. Most kidney stones are not calcium carbonate, they're calcium oxalates, which have nothing to do with vitamin D levels. We've actually in our studies never seen anything like that. And I didn't talk about our studies that have to do with human lactation and vitamin D. And we gave those women between 6,000 and 10,000 units, so they would have enough vitamin D in their milk during lactation to pass it on to their infant, and the infant didn't need to have supplemental vitamin D, because all breastfeeding infants were supposed to have vitamin D supplements. Well, if you do that, we spent years and published that data maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It has changed the practice of lactation, where women can now take 6,000 or 10,000 units, up to 10,000, and put enough vitamin D in their milk that their infants have plenty of vitamin D just from nursing from their mother.
Dr. Hollis, I'd like to change gears a little bit and ask you about vitamin D insufficiency and who may be vulnerable. And I'm thinking about people who may get, well, first of all, those people who are in northern climates, where they don't get much access to the sun. But there are also a lot of people who have clothing, whether it's a Muslim country or whether it's in Israel and Hasidic Jews are pretty well covered. Are there vulnerabilities? And what about people who just live in Seattle or Portland or Maine? They may get some vitamin D during the summer, but boy, come November, December, January, February, probably not much sun.
Yeah, nobody really, to be honest, nobody gets enough vitamin D simply from the sun in the way that we live now. And you talk about insufficiency, and when the COVID stuff started, because we have health disparities with minorities, this is a chronic problem. And be it cancer, prostate cancer or other diseases, minorities always get the short end of the stick and are affected worse. So when COVID came out, first thing I did is I started looking for health disparities. Are the African American population being affected worse by this than everybody else? And the answer was absolutely. It was terrible. I saw first data coming out of Detroit where, the African American population constituted 12% of the population and 40% of the deaths. In our own hospital chain here, I got a call from an intensivist up in middle of South Carolina in a primary black, not primary, but high black population of 40%. He walks through his intensive care unit. Everybody in there was black. And again, those people are suffering mightily from vitamin D sufficiency or outright deficiency. So
remind us why, please.
Yeah. So here's all humans, be white, black, whatever, all have the same capacity to make the same amount of vitamin D. The problem is the darker your skin, the more sunlight you require to make it. So where a light-skinned individual could take 10 minutes, a very dark-skinned individual might need an hour and a half. Nobody's going to spend an hour and a half in the sunlight, even in a summer day. So people with heavy pigmentation are at a tremendous disadvantage. And I think the health disparities in COVID, be it in the UK, which is now paying attention to this. It was so bad in the UK that they were pulling minorities off the front lines of treating patients because so many of them are getting sick and dying. And I think the UK has now woken up to the fact, and they've been using vitamin D in their health workers or in the population in general way more than they have in the past.
So for the average walking around person at this time of year, what would be the likelihood that they would be insufficient or deficient in vitamin D? And these days, people are not going into their doctor's office to get blood tests. So what would be your recommendation on average for what percentage of the population that you may think is deficient should be getting supplements?
So again, we'll come back to what I think optimum level should be for infections and respiratory infections, or warding off cancer, or improving birth outcomes. And those levels, to me, should be between 50 and 80 nanograms per ml. You're never going to get there. Well, a lifeguard would in the summertime, but nobody walking around out there is going to be have those kind of levels. And so you need to take substantial amounts. I would say between 5,000 and 10,000 units a day, depending on your BMI. Heavier people need more for whatever reason to get their 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels up to a place where they should be.
So what Dr. Fauci is doing at 6,000 international units is not out of line from what you're suggesting.
No, he's doing exactly what he should be doing. I haven't ever met Fauci, but he's not a very big man, and 6,000 units to him is probably plenty. I would guess his vitamin D levels are probably in the 60 nanogram range or higher. When Donald Trump was in the hospital, if you looked at the medications he was given, one of them was vitamin D. So they're doing this. It infuriates me that they won't make a meaningful recommendation, but they won't do it.
All right. So we are almost out of time, and we are so grateful that you've been willing to share your expertise with our audience. In terms of meaningful recommendations, what do you suggest for our listeners today?
I suggest that the children, small children, should be getting 1,000 to 2,000 units of vitamin D a day, as all my grandchildren get. I'm always on my children to make sure their grandchildren are getting enough. And for adults, again, I would say 5 to 10,000 units. If you have active cancers, then it's a different ballgame. I've had, I would say 20, 30,000 units per day. And I'll just run, my best friend developed prostate cancer back in 2004. It was bad. He was given 2 years to live. He survived that until about 2 years ago when he finally succumbed to it. He took a lot. He took 30,000 units of vitamin D a day. And when he went back, he was he didn't not take regular treatments, but he would go back to the oncologist, and the guy says, I just don't understand it. You're responding. And he would say, I'm taking vitamin D. And the guy would say, well, that's not it, but keep doing it. So I'll come back to the recommendations. Everybody should be taking, adults should be 5 to 10,000 units, and go into your physician and say, look, I want my level measured. And after taking those levels for, say, 3 months, that's where your level's going to be. It's not going to go higher. It's not going to go, it stays right there. Mine's been stable at 60 for years. It's taken the same amount. It will stabilize and it will be, but it takes about 3 to 4 months to get where it's going to be and where it's going to stay.
Dr. Bruce Hollis, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to Dr. Bruce Hollis, Professor of Pediatrics, Biochemistry, and Molecular Biology, and Director of Pediatric Nutritional Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina. The doses of vitamin D3 supplements that Dr. Hollis describes are outside the range of usual recommendations, so we suggest you discuss your regimen with your own healthcare provider.
We spoke earlier with Dr. David Meltzer, the Fannie L. Pritzker Professor of Medicine, Chief of the Section of Hospital Medicine, and Director of the Center for Health and the Social Sciences at the University of Chicago. You'll find a link to his study on our website.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
And by CocoVia, offering plant-based nutrients in the form of cocoa flavanols for brain and heart health. Online at cocovia.com.
If you would like to buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1240. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. You'll find our e-guide to vitamin D and optimal health in the Health e-guide section. We're making it free to People's Pharmacy listeners this week. It discusses the consequences of low vitamin D levels and how to tell if you are vitamin D deficient.
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post it on our website every Monday morning.
At our website, sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.